Another meeting between the U.S. and Ukrainian officials tentatively scheduled for next week in Saudi Arabia. But this time, no President Zelensky. With us today, I think you guys all recognize we've got Matt Hoh, Marine, former State Department. Matt, welcome to the show as always.
Hey, Gary, it's good to see you.
Matt, I was just saying to you, it always flies by, former State Department. What did you do with the State Department?
I was on State Department teams in Iraq and Afghanistan. So in Iraq, I was on a State Department team where I did reconstruction and political work, had a lot of money on me, paid off a lot of contractors, a lot of reconstruction projects, was involved in political efforts there for a year. I went back to D.C. and worked as a consultant on the Iraq desk for the State Department, and then was appointed into the Foreign Service as a political officer, went to Afghanistan, and then after, people familiar with my story, after 5 months, resigned in protest over the escalation of that war by the Obama administration in 2009.
Yeah, I love that. And so how long was that in totality? Were you with them?
I guess over the course of 5 years, like 3 or 4 out of 5 years. Yeah. So sure. I didn't have a typical or a routine. I didn't go to A100, which is the entry level course for all Foreign Service officers. I was appointed into the Foreign Service, which was also a bit of an odd thing as well. But I mean, so certainly met my wife at the State Department. I actually went and met in the Pentagon, but she was a State Department officer for a long time.
Oh,
yeah. So
love that.
Yep. And bear with me here because for some reason my screen just switched out and Zoom popped up.
All right, no problem.
I've never seen this happen before, and there we are. Now I'm back. Okay.
Beautiful. Well, Matt, we got some. It's breaking news in the sense that it just happened. So we have President Trump in the White House. He was just given his usual taking questions around house, and he ended up getting asked about the Ukraine. So let's hear about the latest as to what's going on with Ukraine, Russia, and all the above. Here we go.
I think we're doing very well with Russia. But right now they're bombing the hell out of Ukraine, and I'm finding it more difficult, frankly, to deal with Ukraine. And they don't have the cards. They don't have the cards. As you know, we're meeting in Saudi Arabia on sometime next week, early. And we're talking, I find that in terms of getting a final settlement, it may be easier dealing with Russia, which is surprising because they have all the cards. I mean, they're bombing the hell out of them right now. And I put a statement in, a very strong statement. Can't do that. You can't do that.
Mr. President.
We're trying to help them. And Ukraine has to get on the ball and get a job done. Michael, could you come up here? I see Michael back there. Yeah, good. I'm glad. He's traveling all over the world. I just saw him come in the door. Could you give a little definition of what's going on, please?
Sure. Well, the president has been crystal clear, and he's been clear to all sides. The fighting has to stop. Both sides need to get to the table. We had a good engagement. Both leaders have said only President Trump could do so, and only he has been able to do so. We had an initial engagement with the Russians. The Ukrainians had a great opportunity to bind our economies together through that mineral deal. Unfortunately, that didn't go so well, but we think we're going to get things back on track. Secretary Rubio, myself and the Ukrainian delegation will be meeting in Saudi Arabia next week to get these talks back on track, get the ceasefire in place, and drive peace home under President Trump's leadership.
I think both parties want to settle. I think if I wasn't president, this war would have had no chance of settlement, zero chance. But I think we're going to get it settled and stopped.
Did you hear that, Matt? He says that he thinks it's going to be easier to work with Russia than it is with Ukraine. Did you hear that?
Well, certainly Russia, as he says, he likes the poker playing analogy, right? He likes the card analogy, who's holding the cards. And he is correct in the sense that Russia has the upper hand here. Russia has the leverage in these talks. Russia can walk away without consequence. I mean, of course, consequence, the war would continue. And I think the Russians do want a ceasefire and they do want a permanent agreement to bring about stability. I have to agree with Trump in the sense that the Ukrainian government, as it is, has a lot to lose through a peace deal. Essentially, their position of power, their position in the government, right? The good things they got going on. You could understand that dynamic there. And I don't think many people are surprised that the Ukrainians have been reluctant to enter into negotiations, for basic things such as, again, not having leverage, being the weaker party, but as well, the fact that the stakes are so high for them. And this is an incredibly corrupt, parasitic, kleptocratic government in Kyiv, known this for years and years. They're looking at it, I think, the same way that we saw the Afghan government all the time deal with the idea of negotiations, whether it was under President Bush, under President Obama, under President Trump, and into President Biden's time, that all they had to stand was to lose. That they had the world's superpower backing them up. They were being kept propped up with military support, with incredible amounts of cash, and it was a good thing. So why would they willingly negotiate away a good deal? Ukraine's in a different position, of course. The Afghan government didn't have a 1 million man Russian army, or however big the Russian army is now. With two some odd million total in their armed forces, whatever, beating against it. But yeah, I mean, so I don't think it's a surprise to hear Donald Trump say that, even as bad as that soundbite is going to sound to a lot of people in the U.S.
Well, they're going to jump on that. What do you mean it's easier with Putin? What are you talking about?
Right,
You guys are
exactly.
too. He's always too chummy with Putin, right?
Yeah, that's always, and that's going to be the hindrance. I mean, but even too, President Obama. People remember President Obama had that hot mic moment with Vladimir
Oh,
Putin,
yeah.
discussing nuclear reduction, or nuclear arms treaty, the START treaty. He said,
Yeah,
"Hey,
talk to me after the election. Wasn't that what he
exactly,
said?
exactly." He basically leaned over to him and said, a
It's
paraphrase,
like,
"Hey, Vlad, I'm with you on getting this nuclear deal done. I can't get it done during my first term. It has to occur after I'm reelected." That
it was
being
like
seen
a
as,
political pillow talk.
it really was. It was like, if I'm recalling it correctly, because it's been 14 years now or so since it occurred, 13, 14 years. Yeah, he was. It really was kind of, he leaned into him. But so you could see even that, though, like environment, the milieu, right? The atmosphere of American perceptions in terms of the elite perception, what's put out through the media. Of course, those who are interested in this, the military-industrial complex, the fossil fuel companies, the banks, etc. Uh, they don't, regardless of who's in the Oval Office, they are going to use everything possible, including throwing this slur that you're a Putin puppet or whatever at whoever, again, is in the Oval Office, if it's somehow they feel endangering their interests. And so, yeah, I think you'll see. I mean, we're seeing that, right? Of course, the banks lose out. BlackRock, as many people know, already have signed a deal with the Ukrainian government to, basically own Ukraine after the war is
Yeah.
over. They had a huge amount of investment that they are going to direct and control in terms of Ukraine's reconstruction. Uh,
No
and
surprise
so
there, right, Matt? Wasn't that almost predictable in
that's
your eyes? I mean,
absolutely predictable. I mean, and the thing about how the Ukrainians, if they want to stay in power, they need to play this out. They need to say to BlackRock and to State Street and Vanguard and whoever else is financing this, are going to be in those positions, going to benefit from those contracts being actually achieved, right? So if I was Zelensky, I would say to BlackRock and the others, look, if you want your money, you better keep me in power, because any honest government, any legitimate government that replaces me is going to rip up these contracts. And the same, go to Lockheed, Raytheon, Northrop, whoever, in terms of the military contracts. There are tens of billions of dollars at stake here for
yeah,
the American military industrial complex if the war ends. I mean, there you have tens of billions of dollars of forward contracts, essentially, of contracts that are destined to be filled in the coming years, in the coming decades, that if the war ends or a new government comes into power, may not come to pass. So again, Zelensky's thing to the heads of the military industrial complex, the banks, I can go in the same explanation with the fossil fuel companies, right? Is if you want the good times to keep going, if you want your tens of billions of dollars to continue to come into you, well, then you better ensure I stay in power. And if that means this war has to keep on going, that's what has to happen.
Matt, that's why I was flabbergasted. I couldn't believe that Zelensky didn't more readily embrace this mineral deal. And they say, anytime you say mineral deal to the administration, they say, no, it's not a mineral deal. It's a, you know what the term they use?
I think it's, I mean, strategic metals is
yeah. Oh yeah. And they even back away from metals. They trying to say it's just a financial deal, whatever. They're trying to back away to not to promote so much the mineral deal. But with what you're explaining there about how BlackRock and any other financiers that are, getting involved here, you would have thought, pardon me, I would have thought that Zelensky would jump on the deal, that would be the exact golden key to secure his future, because there would be so much money involved, and then that's what's on the table, rather than relying upon your tanks and your drones, thinking that will carry you forward. Wasn't that like so boneheaded on his part?
It was, and supposedly the Europeans, as well as many Republicans and Democrats in the U.S. Congress, were upset with him for that, because, as you said, Gary, that's what he had. He had to come in. He had to, and he did 30. They did 39 minutes, and you could argue what occurred there, whose fault it is. I think it was kind of like I think Vance was trying to set up a good cop, bad cop routine there for the cameras at the end. And then Trump just didn't follow through on the good cop side of it. But I mean, but who knows? Pox on all houses, pox on all parties there. But I would say, yeah, exactly. If Zelensky had gotten that deal, then you've got the U.S. with a very real interest, in particularly an administration and a president. I mean, you see the obsequious way that his administration refers to every action as being for coming from the president's hand or his mouth or his mind or his heart or whatever, in a way that, most administrations will utilize that type of terminology. The president thinks the best way forward in Afghanistan or with unemployment is, ABC. But oftentimes you'll hear them say things like this administration, or it's our thinking. This administration, in terms of the Trump administration, is very much, it is all about Donald Trump.
Yes, it is.
So that's a way to tie it. And he's such everything is so transactional. And for him, that this idea of him having these large metal and mineral deposits under contract in Ukraine, including, if the Ukrainians were smart, try and slip some in that the Russians are now have by possession, by being occupying those areas. Might as well try and slip those through as well, to try and really reel the Americans in on this. And he was unable to do it. And I think that's why there's a lot of anger about this, both in Europe as well as in the United States.
So, and then earlier, maybe even tied to that anger, what ended up unfolding, or the ripple effect from that, earlier this week, Donald Trump ordered both military aid and intelligence being withheld from Ukraine. Now, here's how the special envoy to Ukraine and Russia, General Keith Kellogg, explains it.
What is the concrete effect of the abrupt end of military resupply to Ukraine and the end of the provision of intelligence and targeting data?
The best way I can describe it is sort of like hitting a mule with a 2x4 across the nose. You got their attention, and it is significant, obviously, because of the support that we give. Okay, but it's one way to sort of get your attention to do it. But it's a pause. It's not an end. It's not like, Michael, it's not like they didn't know this was coming. They got fair warning it was coming. I told them, and they were told last week as well.
Okay, so this whole withholding it was no surprise, and no matter how it was portrayed otherwise. But you know what I thought was surprising is that, you know how many people are saying, hey, you want to stop this war? Well, then just withhold everything. That'll stop the war. And when this came down, I didn't hear the people that were calling for that applauding the issue that both things were being withheld. It was almost like silence that, well,
Right.
that's, you kept calling his meaning the administration's bluff that you don't really want to end this war because you're still supplying them. Then when they pull it back, I didn't hear anybody applauding the arrangement of that. How did you see that withholding, Matt?
Yeah, first to go to Kellogg's comments, so General Kellogg's comments about how
Mhm.
they were warned, and this, as I was just saying before about this administration and the White House being so focused around the individual who's the president. The same, I believe, is the case in Ukraine. Of course, there are always people who are involved, who have people's ears, who play a role like a Rasputin, or who have actual agency to get things done. But it's been a year and a half now, Gary, since we had that Time magazine cover story
Oh,
about Zelensky, right? Saying how people
yeah.
like in his circle, saying he's delusional and messianic, right? So here you have
After
General
him being
Kellogg
the man of the year, by the way, the year before,
the year
right?
before being the man of the year.
One
Exactly.
year, a one
Right.
year change
Which
out.
was quicker than Karzai's degradation. Karzai, it took several years before the knives started coming out for him. Karzai was the man of the year as well in 2002, I believe. But
Really?
um,
Wow.
uh, there's this idea of withholding that. Um, it all depends what they're actually doing in the sense of whether or not anything's actually being withheld. Whether it's not they're putting a pause on it, but that doesn't mean it's not for munition shipments that won't go until May, right? I mean, so
Right, right.
there's that type of course, those who are supportive of the war, who don't want this war to end, are screaming bloody murder. And I think politically this may have been a tough decision for the White House. I mean, they're not stupid. They had to know that if this doesn't go the way we want it to go, we are really going to be blamed for betraying and stabbing the Ukrainians in the back. I mean, if there's no, we're just talking about how the standard easy line to attack anything this White House does, or anyone who wants peace in Ukraine does, is to label them as a friend of the Kremlin. And here you have the White House turning off weapons and intelligence. That's, if this doesn't go the way it's desired to by the White House, then that's going to be a really, really ugly scene in terms of trying to explain why you stopped munitions and why you stopped intelligence. Certainly the idea is there that they're doing this to put very real and significant pressure on it. The devil's in the details as to whether or not this actually matters. There's a
Right.
story, right? I mean, so we'll see. But with these missile attacks and drone attacks that Russia's been launching the last couple of nights,
Yeah, they
you
haven't
know,
slowed down.
they haven't slowed down. And of course, the thing I heard on the radio about it was that, the missile strike that killed people in Zelensky's hometown was successful because the United States is no longer sharing intelligence with the Russians. Whether or not that's true or not, who knows? But
Right.
that is what the media is going to say, particularly the media that's been selling this war for the last 3 years. But it's a strong, bold move. This is a move that certainly it's been successful already, in the sense that it's been almost a week now since I think they said they were going to stop sending weapons, and immediately within 24 hours, the response from the Ukrainians was essentially a 180. If you look at what the
Yeah.
Ukrainians were saying immediately following the interaction at the White House last Friday to what they were saying on Sunday or Monday, whenever it was, a few hours after the weapons pause was announced, you can see that's already been successful in that sense. Why they chose to also then say we're not going to give you intelligence, I don't know. But that's that they decided to do.
Yeah. That's boy, you leave you would know. You leave a guy naked without any of that intel. My gosh.
Yeah, it
Do
just
something like
seems
that.
to me politically was not necessary to do that. But who knows where they were in the sense of what the Ukrainians were really going to go through. Maybe they had to
Yeah.
do that because they felt all the Ukrainians the Ukrainians. Zelensky put out that long apology X post or Twitter post,
Right.
right? As well as saying nobody wants peace more than us. We are dedicated. We're going to propose today a partial ceasefire, right? Doing all the things that he was asked to do as soon as this administration came in. Maybe the intelligence aspect was because this administration doesn't trust the Ukrainians, and they feel that all that's going to happen is going to be a just a Twitter post. There's also too the fact that this may as well be a shot at the Europeans. This may well be certainly a message to the Europeans how serious the Americans are about not just leaving the Ukraine war, but the entire spectrum of European security issues. And it may be in some way. I think this is far fetched, but I'll say it. It may have been a show of goodwill to the Russians as well to encourage negotiations, just as that announcement on Monday, I think it was, about shutting down offensive cyber attacks on Russia, which I think many Americans should say we're offensively cyber attacking Russia, and they're why do we not? When was this discussed in the Congress, kind of thing? I think many Americans should be asking that question, but I think that ultimately was. And again, we don't know the scale or details of it, but ultimately that was also to a goodwill gesture or a sign of good faith or an entering into a reciprocal thing where the Russians have said they're going to stop attacking us, which now you're in a phase where you're establishing trust, right? And that's just important to have occur here is that the Americans and the Russians have trust with each other. The Ukrainians and the Russians have already demonstrated that. Of course, they have conducted multiple prisoner swaps. They've had the Black Sea grain deal, which of course fell apart. But the fact that it was able to be put in place, there's been other aspects of diplomacy on a lower scale that have shown that the Ukrainians and the Russians can deal with each other, and excluding the Black Sea grain deal, which was, again, sort of like the Istanbul Accords, more an issue of foreign powers and foreign interests pulling the Ukrainians out of something. So I think that's what you're seeing with the Americans and the Russians right now, probably a back and forth of gestures to establish that trust.
I agree. It seems like it's almost it's expert political theater for diplomacy, being played out like this in the realm of taking actions like this and sending your signals through these actions. I thought it was rather astute. So then in response to the withholding of military aid and intelligence, the Europeans called an emergency meeting in Brussels. Boy, that didn't take long, did it? And here's one of the responses from the president here. You'll hear her speaking as to how she's responding to this. So they're going to fill the gap here, Matt.
This is a watershed moment for Europe. And Ukraine, as part of our European family, it's also a watershed moment for Ukraine. Europe faces a clear and present danger, and therefore Europe has to be able to protect itself, to defend itself, as we have to put Ukraine in a position to protect itself and to push for a lasting and just peace. We want a peace through strength. And this is the reason why I present today to the leaders the Rearm Europe plan. The Rearm Europe plan provides up to 800 billion euros for defense investment. It gives the member states possibility to invest in the Ukrainian defense industry or to procure military capabilities that go right away to Ukraine. So it is to the benefit of rearming Europe, rearming the European Union, but also arming Ukraine in its existential fight for its sovereignty and territorial integrity.
So Matt, every time that she talks about peace, it only has to do with weapons, it seems. You'd think they'd want to maybe not necessarily admonish him, but let's say encourage him about, that deal that you kind of walked out on. You might want to rethink it. No. They bring him right back in to let's get these weapons happening. In fact, let's throw a crazy amount of money at it to make sure that and it's not only you, by the way, President Zelensky, we all got to be stronger.
This is Ursula von der Leyen sees her opportunity here to establish the EU as a peer to Russia, to China, and to the United States. And to have this supranational role of being over the top of all these various nations. What was the EU have 28 nations or something like that, right?
But even with those. But even with those numbers, Matt, this is it's a pipe dream, right? There's no chance.
Well, I don't think Ukraine is just the axis upon which this push for power, this desire is made real on her part, right? This Ukraine is just the uh, 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 avenue through which the EU expands in power. I mean, certainly, you look at if people remember all our libertarian friends out there, Randolph Bourne, right? And war is the health of the state. And you see this being played out with the European Union as well as many nations within Europe. This idea that war is what gives the state meaning. War is what is going to give the European Union meaning. And someone like von der Leyen, the idea that she could then be the equal because you've got this European powerhouse with a combined GDP roughly the same as the Americans, a larger population, right?
Oh,
That
I
she
didn't
is
realize
now
that.
the head of a peer, right, of the world powers in this multipolar world that we are heading into, or that we're already in. Some would argue
Yeah.
there will be those who are at the top, and she believes, and others believe, that the EU can be one of them if they can bang heads and get people together. I just heard Ambassador Chaz Freeman. He may have said it, maybe on your program where he referenced Kissinger. And Kissinger says the problem with Europe, of course, is when I want to call Europe, which phone number do I call? Right? In the sense that Europe is incredibly difficult in terms of getting any type of consensus, because this is greater than I remember as a kid, particularly in the 80s, when the idea of the EU, or the EC, particularly as they referred to it back then, the European Commission, the European Community, was coming into being. The idea was always explained. It was like essentially making a United States of Europe, but that's not the case. These are actual nation states that have giving up degrees of their sovereignty. In the United States, we're a federal republic, right, where the states are subordinate to the interests of the nation. They don't have their own sovereignty in the way that a nation state does. No more than a county has sovereignty over a state here in the United States, if people want to argue that fact, or a town over a county. It's just the way it's structured. That's not the way the European Union is. So what do they need? They need an outside threat. They need some type of great peril, right? They need some type of danger to unite them, particularly one that is well established. The Great Red Scare. There was a scare with Russia well before they were red, right? When they were still czarist white, in the 19th century, the Russians were the boogeymen of many in Europe, particularly in Western Europe. And so, as well as then just the historical issues throughout Central and Eastern Europe as well. So you have a ready-made villain to establish that need for a reinforced, combined, intertwined Europe that has a strong leadership. And that's when I hear van der Leyen speaking about, I hear all the things about Ukraine. I hear what she's saying about it. I hear how she wants to invest in their defense industry, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I see first and foremost this desire for power, this desire to have a supranational European Union with its own army that allows whoever's at the top of that, whoever is the leader of the EU, to be among. And so this is why it's important when we hear this week that France, you hear President Macron say how he's willing to extend their nuclear weapons coverage or umbrella to other nations. Well, that essentially then makes the EU into a nuclear power as well. And of course, Britain is on the outside of that. But where the Brits end up going because of that, and it's I think why the Labour Party is so keen through Keir Starmer's government to be first and foremost among the Europeans in showing this need to be there to fight back against this, what they would claim is existential threat from Russia, but also to demonstrate how they still fit into Europe in many ways, even though they're not part of the EU.
Right. So this is perfect. You didn't even know that I'm doing this. I get some sound together before a show.
Yeah.
And I don't tell Matt all the sound that I have. I'll say, hey, I'll tell Matt, yeah, I've got some great sound for you today, and we'll
Well,
talk.
particularly when I show up at with the show's at 1, and I show up at 1 minute and 49 seconds. Yeah. So
Matt.
yeah.
We love you.
So there's not a lot of time to prep. We
Yeah.
got 10 seconds before we're late.
Ready, set, go.
Yeah.
So it's funny that you bring Macron up. So here's I shouldn't say the only one, but here's one of the sanest voices in the European community. And it's funny you should bring up Macron. So here we've got, I think you'll recognize him.
Elnök úr, éppen úton vagyunk Párizsba, ma Emmanuel Macron francia elnökkel fog találkozni. Mit vár a találkozótól?
Van egy alapvető változás. Az amerikaiak eddig a háború oldalán álltak, most meg a béke oldalára álltak. Én azt szeretném megtudni, hogyha 3 év alatt nem tudták a háborúzó felek legyőzni Oroszországot és győzelemre segíteni Ukrajnát. Úgyhogy az amerikaiak is a háború táborban voltak. Most az amerikaiak már nincsenek ott, tehát a háborúpárti tábor sokkal gyengébb. Most miért gondolják, hogy ugyanezt a háborút meg tudják nyerni? Én erre szeretnék egy választ kapni. Mitől észszerű a francia, illetve a háborúpárti álláspont?
So they think they can win the same war that America couldn't win,
Right.
but they're going to go and do it anyway. Don't you wish this guy got a little bit more press?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting again how things are shaping out, and you see in Bosnia and Herzegovina this week. It's been going on for a while, but the Republic of Srpska, which is part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which of course was created out of Dayton Accords in 1995. Everyone remembers 30 years ago in the Yugoslav War and whatnot. And now you've got the ethnic federation or ethnic Serb Republic, I should say, within Bosnia and Herzegovina wanting to split from Bosnia and Herzegovina. And of course, you're seeing in Europe an aligning, right? So you have Hungary, you have the Republic of Srpska, which is what that's called. And, you'd have, of course, Slovaks. I mean, in others throughout the region that, would align with Russia. So you see all these various countries starting to begin the process of creating that newer world order. So it's interesting to watch that. But yeah, the folly of it, to think that somehow you're going to, particularly when, Keir Starmer, they had that meeting on Monday, I believe it was, in London. Yeah. And Starmer comes out and he says, here's our 4-point plan. And the idea of having European military forces, keeping the peace, as they would say, in Ukraine, they still are begging for the Americans. There's no way that the Europeans can fight without the Americans. I think it's just practically impossible. I think the interoperability, as it is called, was not just a sales gimmick to ensure, American military and weapons contractors, had a contained or a captured market in Europe. It also had to do with the practical needs of a military for everyone to be able to fight together, talk to one another, resupply one another. And then what you have is that you have within the NATO structure, different militaries would more or less be assumed to be taking on certain aspects that would occur in the war fighting, or some just simply have greater technologies, greater resources. Right. And so this idea, I know Danny and I spoke with this about this a week or two ago, would the Europeans even be able to fight without the Americans? One of the things saw that yesterday was the UK said we can't fire our Storm Shadow missiles in support of Ukraine without the American intelligence. Right. Wow. I mean, so that's one example of how all this is interrelated. So when the
I was just saying, after Starmer, during those 4 points that he set out, Starmer himself says, and by the way, a little caveat, we kind of need you, America, to back us up on this.
Right. It's probably, it's just not possible probably for the Brits to fight. And they've got a very small military. The British military, you could put all of it into, or you could put not the military, but you could put the British Army into Giant Stadium in the Meadowlands and still have like 10,000 seats left over.
Wow.
I mean,
really? Is that what it is?
I mean, maybe a plus or minus a few thousand, I guess, There's another stat out there too that's really explains what we're talking with here, where you have the British have roughly 25 warships, right? Ships of the line, as used to be called, ships that can fight, ships that can shoot. They have roughly about 25 of them, but they have more than 30 admirals. So they have more admirals than they have warships, right? So a lot of this is just the
So
reality.
that's who we're taking after. That's who America's taking
Well,
after.
it is. It's the idea of being a paper tiger, being more bark than bite. And it wasn't Trump who first identified that the Europeans are not spending as much as they quote should unquote. It was Barack Obama. Barack Obama made this an issue during his presidency, that the spending of the Europeans was not anywhere near what anyone who looked at total NATO spending would say this is a fair deal or this makes sense based upon the size of your economies. I mean, so, this is something that even somebody who wants to get rid of NATO or say lessen America's commitment to NATO, or on the other side, if you're a full proponent of NATO, you can't look at the spending and the force levels of the European militaries over the last 2 decades and say that they're commensurate with the rhetoric that's coming from their leader's mouth. Now, of course, some of that's all purposeful, right? And this idea of providing the rationale for this spending just spoke about how that benefits the EU, but it also benefits a lot of these parties in Europe that are not doing so well politically. So they're doubling down on the militarism, doubling down on the nationalism as a way to distract voters from other issues such as the economy, right? So you have this reality of a Europe that and I don't think they should have been spending that much money. I don't think the EU should have its own army. I don't think the Europeans should be spending 2 or 2.5 or 3 or 3.5%, or God help them, 5% of their GDP on defense. I don't think they should be. I think they should have armies that are capable to defend their interests and their interests alone, and that they should trade with the rest of the world and live well. But that unfortunately is not how most in power see it. And you have to remember too, another thing about the Europeans, Gary, is that most of them have imperial histories of their own. So when you travel to London or you go to Copenhagen or wherever you go, you're going to see statues to these admirals from long ago times who went someplace and conquered and slaughtered a whole bunch of indigenous people and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They have that in their history books as well. And this idea of being able to somehow revisit that is very intoxicating. I say that from experience, from being in Europe during the Afghan war, trying to get European countries to realize the folly of it, the futility of it, the stupidity of that war. I went to Holland a couple of times to talk to the Dutch, because if people remember, in late 2009, early 2010, Dutch government comes into power, pulls the Dutch out of Afghanistan. That government quickly falls. Actually, a conservative government comes in, and they want to put the Dutch back into Afghanistan. And actually, I went there, and I was on behalf of at that point, wasn't being paid by them, but the folks who brought me over were the Dutch intelligence folks, to talk to their politicians, essentially say, why are you jumping back into this quicksand? I go to Denmark, and at that time, I don't know if it finished out this way, but at that time, the country with the highest per capita casualties in Afghanistan were the Danes. They had a battalion minus maybe down in Helmand province, if I remember correctly. And they were basically like Fort Apache type of thing, where they were in the middle of the bad guys' territory, and they were constantly attacked. And the Danes were really proud of it. Right. And so this idea of whether it's their history, whether it's the idea of being, we're going to be the first among the equals in the American empire, or we're somehow going to have more favor for the Americans, or we're with big kids here, right? The little kids tagging along with the big kids, like that type of ego is all there. And it drives a lot of this. Wish you could say it's just basically based on rationality, based on logic, experience, history, etc. But so much of it is based on ego.
Talking about ego, talking about the psychology of war. Just wanted to alert our audience, and maybe even to you, Danny. Pardon me, Matt. regarding what Trump said this morning. So, talking about the psychology of war and diplomacy, True Social this morning, Donald says, based on the Donald, I'm sorry, Mr. President, based on the fact that Russia is absolutely pounding Ukraine on the battlefield right now, I'm strongly considering large-scale banking sanctions and tariffs on Russia until a ceasefire and final settlement agreement on peace is reached. To Russia and Ukraine, get to the table right now before it's too late. Thank you. How to read this? I don't know, Matt. I think it's more of the what you were saying earlier is a tepid way because I don't know how much impact it'll really have. That's why I say it's tepid, because how often, I mean, going back to Biden, I mean, increasing sanctions for years, we've been increasing sanctions. Is this just more smoke than any real fire?
I think it's probably more smoke. I think it's probably a way to deflect criticism. I mean, and it may be a sign too to the Russians, though, to be fair to the Trump administration, that okay, we are not your partner in this. We have our own interests. We're trying to get out of this. We're not going to negotiate this for your benefit. We're negotiating it for our benefit, which I think is the way that, but the idea that somehow
it's a perfect play on Trump, right? I mean, here it can, pretend to be looking tough with
right.
Putin when they both know. It's almost like, he's winking at Putin. You know what I'm saying here, right?
Well, the thing about it, we've got to be careful. You got to be careful about that, just because those who are around Trump have been very anti-Russia and were very pro-Ukraine war. Like Mike Waltz, who he just, up until the day before the election, he was talking about sending longer range missiles to Ukraine. Right.
So his national security advisor was
right. And Rubio as well was a hawk until this last election cycle. Rubio was as much of a hawk on Ukraine as anyone else. Right. I mean, certainly Stefanik at the UN, Hegseth at the Pentagon. These are all people that were pro-Ukraine war and who just, saw Russia as one of the top three enemies, maybe
Evils.
Top four because Cruz or five because Cruz would throw Cuba and Venezuela in there as well. But one of the things that make you chuckle about this, you laugh about this, is the fact that the sanctions haven't worked before. So why would the Russians take this seriously? And supposedly we already sanctioned everything. Supposedly the only thing that we actually we only trade with the Russians anymore is uranium. That's my understanding, right? I mean, so where are these tariffs going to be applied to? I mean, so the whole thing is kind of comical. Yeah. Like, do you really think the Russians are scared of this? They've withstood years of American sanctions. They prepared for them. They saw how we sanctioned other countries like Iran and Venezuela. They prepared for them. They started receiving the sanctions in the Obama administration, really got sanctioned hard in the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, then, doubly or triply so the Biden administration. And they've come out pretty well on the other side. I mean, I don't think anyone, the Russians themselves will say things aren't great. We've got high inflation, high interest rates, things like that. We're spending a third of our federal budget on this war. Nobody wants to be doing that type of thing, right? Anyone who's sane doesn't, at least, and so no, things aren't great, but we're doing okay. And there's parts of the Russian economy that are doing incredible, and there's a question out there about whether or not, a magic wave is wand and this thing ends tonight, that the Russians would actually reintegrate, if you will, back into the West, that the Russia would seek out the trading and the trade relationships that it had with the West prior to February 2022, or whether they would continue the path of going, south or east, if you will, of developing and growing the relationships in the markets that they have developed out of necessity in the last several years. So the Russians, I don't know. I don't think anyone at the Kremlin or the foreign ministry is too concerned about this. And I think, it was more for PR, as you were saying, because if they do throw any more sanctions on, again, I'm not really entirely sure what. I know there's sanctions. I should take that back, because there are sanctions that can be applied to the oil and gas sector with regards to banking that would be essentially a hand grenade in the world's economy, that it would be a self-inflicted wound on the United States to do something like that. So even though, the Russian oil gas industry has been sanctioned, they're using those ghost tankers, they're selling their oil to India. India is refining it and then sending it to other places, particularly Europeans, right? There's all that going on. We know that's all going on, but there's still a lot of financial above board transactions that are occurring that, from my understanding, could be sanctioned, but that would be, again, throwing a hand grenade into the world's economy.
Got it. Yeah. Matt, I love talking to you. Love hearing your thoughts on things. Hey, I think I'm doing this for a lot of people. Your Free Assange poster was taken down. You finally got that down.
Well, I
Beautiful.
kept it up for a number of reasons. One, because there's a pardon Julian Assange campaign. I had it up for 4 years or so, 5 years, forget when I got it. But there was the pardon campaign. It doesn't seem at all as if Trump is going to pardon Julian Assange.
Really?
No, I don't see it. Maybe I'm just out of the loop on it, but it doesn't seem like it's going to happen anytime soon. But Trump is Trump, so he can be pardoning him right now as we speak.
What time is it?
Yeah, I mean, there are a few things. I do some media training work for people, and I always tell people, don't have stuff behind them that is a distraction, or that you can't read clearly, or that makes your backspace too clutter, or gives off a glare, and all of that does that, right? So, I mean, a bit of, but yeah, I mean, yeah. So it was time to change it up, and just but still a very big supporter of, Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, and I think everyone agrees with what's occurring right now with this kleptocracy in the White House that we're enduring. That we need an organization like WikiLeaks and someone like Julian Assange now as much as ever. Yeah.
Well, Matt, as always, so grateful for you coming on, and love hearing your insights. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks, Gary.
All right. And everyone, thank you so much. Listen, we don't take it lightly that you come here and you spend time with us. It means a lot to us. So I just want to know how much you're appreciated. And today at 2:30, Danny will be back. Russia bombarding Ukraine while the diplomats timidly ponder. So Danny will be here at 2:30 Eastern time, that is. So please come back, and we'll see you then, unintimidated, uncompromised.